page of The Telegraph. If you have just woken up, it says the Army eases security checks in a drive for diversity. Yes, really, the British Army wants to relax security checks for recruits from overseas to boost diversity and inclusion. Now, Britain's armed forces have consistently failed to hit recruitment targets and are looking overseas to boost ethnic minority representation. It currently stands at 14% of the regular army. It vows to challenge security clearance requirements to boost representation in the intelligence and officer corps positions which have uncontrolled access to secret assets. Catherine, diversity is important, but as one of our callers said, it's a two-way street, isn't it? I'm deeply nervous that all of these institutions have been infiltrated with people who are saying diversity is everything, we need to do that. And as a result, what we're doing is actually we are watering down the very essence of our services.
I think that's an interesting point, because at the moment we're having a recruitment crisis, right, in the army. There's panic that we won't be able to staff a civilian army if we were to go into any sort of conflict, and there's worry that young people are very disillusioned and not willing to fight for their country, right? And I mean, I think it's a big question of how are we going to incentivise people to join the army?
Pay them more? Look after them?
100%. I think those are important things. But there is also a group of people in the United Kingdom who are probably quite disillusioned by the institution that is the army. And I think it would be interesting. I don't think this is the way to go about this. I think that loosening security checks is just a stupid idea, realistically.
And Jack, when you listen to people like Sir Richard Dearlove, he was the head of MI6 between 1999 and 2004. He says if we are prioritising diversity, equality and inclusion in matters of national security, understatement of the year, that's very worrying.
It is. I mean, fundamentally, what is the goal of the army? Are prioritising DEI initiatives going to get in the way of creating a force that is going to be, protecting the state in foreign affairs? I don't know if it is. I don't think this is a massively important focus for the army. I don't think it's an issue, really.
What I would do is I would say, okay, let's apply this to other areas. Do you want your brain surgeon now not to be a doctor because we can't get enough brain surgeons?
I don't think there's in this scheme anyway that they're not doing any sort of meritocratic recruitment. They're just trying to incentivise like a wider pool of talent.
But aren't we dropping standards, essentially, is what we're doing? We're dropping standards and saying we need people, so therefore, because DEI is paramount in everything we do, we're dropping standards and allowing those people who may not have necessarily got in, we're going to allow them in and access to state secrets. That is quite clearly bonkers.
I think that's a pretty sensible statement to make, that it's that we shouldn't be reducing the barrier to security clearance. There's no doubt about that.
Well, in terms of this relaxed vetting policy, I've actually seen enormous pushback here. It's been criticised as wicked in an open letter to Grant Shapps, who, by the way, is apparently livid over what is going on. And this comes from 12 former senior military officers, and they say with Islamism and other extremism rampant, this policy is nothing short of dangerous madness. Who is promoting all of this? We see it everywhere. The health service, which we both have worked for in the past, and one of us still does. Again, it seems they're obsessed with diversity and inclusion. If you go to see a doctor, I want a really good doctor. If I want someone to fight, I want someone who believes passionately in the country.
If you have a police officer, you want them to be able to run down the road.
Yes.
I think there's questions to be asked about the standard of service that's been provided, especially within the public sector. I don't think there's really strong evidence to suggest that the quality of services has reduced as a result of DEI initiatives. But whether there's a flip side to that, to say there's evidence to suggest that the quality has increased, I don't know if that's there either.
Can I give you an example of where there is evidence?
Of course, yeah.
So in the States at the moment, there have been more near misses of planes over the last 5 years than they've ever had in history.
Near misses.
But is that down to diversity?
Apparently so. Apparently they're lowering the levels of the people who are air traffic controllers.
We're talking near misses as in like plane crashes, right?
Or two planes coming close
together, or landing on the same runway at the same time. And they are putting it down to diversity targets being used to recruit air traffic controllers.
And you wouldn't say it's to do with the training standards?
Well, that's obviously something that comes.
But aren't these linked together? Which is, if you're dropping the entry criteria and you're not getting a strong calibre of candidate, then that is reflected in your practice.
I think the question really is, to what extent are they dropping the standards? I think there is so much nuance within that, and the question needs to be asked.
But if you've got all of these senior figures in the armed forces saying this is quite frankly bonkers, aren't you worried?
I would like to point out that those senior figures tend to be of a particular demographic. I'm not saying that necessarily...
Or have a certain amount of experience.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And as I said, I don't agree with the policy. I don't think it's a very good thing to do. But there is room for other trains of thoughts in lots of different forms of thinking. And I think as long as standards are not put at risk, it's important to elevate.
I agree, and I think there's definitely in the story being reported by the Telegraph, there's definitely a selection bias going on here, isn't there? You know, they're talking to the people that they want to get the answers from, because you know they've got a narrative and a story that they want to push, and that's understandable. That's fine.
But why is Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, absolutely incandescent about what is going on?
Well, for the same reasons that I think we agreed that it's a pretty silly policy that you're lowering the standards of security clearance. But whether it's sorry, no, go on.
So there's one particular paragraph in that letter which I have here. The Russians, Iranians and Chinese will be observing our descent into self-hatred and obsessing over diversity and inclusion with glee. These intolerable policies are forcing the British Armed Forces into moral disarmament that it cannot withstand.
I would say there's a difference between lowering security standards and letting any old person in, which might be a risk to state security.
But we should never lower standards, should we?
But saying that diversity and pushing up diversity is self-hatred and morally ambiguous, I think that's just silly.
Well, what I'm talking about is prioritising here. Surely what we want to do is keep standards high, make sure it's accessible to everyone, but not go down that blind rabbit hole of chasing diversity.
I think that's right. But the question here is really, are they prioritising diversity? Is this just a change in is this just a change in policy?
No,
or is this
they have a quota.
Above?
They have a quota that they want to get to. They're at 14%. It was, I think, 12.6% last year or thereabouts. They want it higher still.
I think the answer is
it shouldn't matter about the diversity makeup.
It is particularly interesting that most of this recruitment wants to come from overseas rather than potentially focusing on British nationals who could potentially...
So that's a brilliant answer. And when you look at Sir General Patrick Sanders saying that actually we need to take this very seriously, we're old enough to remember the threat of nuclear warfare, for example.
Well, I think the threat's still there. You know, I think we're closer to a nuclear war than we've been in a very, very long time.
Agree.
And I think the median person is definitely underrating the probabilities and the chances of this occurring. You know, we're in systems where the risk of nuclear war could be escalated very, very quickly, really, really quickly, and we're in really interconnected sort of geopolitical system in a way that hasn't, you know, it wasn't the case 40 years ago. So
let me ask you a question then. In terms of the citizen army, would you be prepared to fight for this country?
Well, I have a very close friend actually who is he's doing is it officer training?
Yes.
In the reserve. Yeah. Yes. In the reserve army, and I you know, I think I've got a lot of respect for that. If there was a war being called, you know, if people were called up for a war in the next couple of weeks, I think you would be surprised. Not you personally. One would be surprised the amount of people who actually would
pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, would sign up.
Do you?
Well, no, I'm not saying I would, but I think that depending on the context, I will say no comment to that.
What job would you want in the army?
Hang on a minute. You can't. If there's a recruitment call, you can't then say, well, it depends on the context.
Well, it does depend on the context. Who are we fighting and for what reason?
That's a good point.
I'm not just going to blindly.
Do I get to fight my friends? You know, if I can go down and join up with my housemates.
There's parts of the government that I would go down fighting myself in our own country. I don't think that it's fair.
We are. Russia poses an existential threat to this country. Let's say Russia does invade a NATO country. We then go to war.
Yeah.
Would you then sign up?
I wouldn't sign up if Russia is going to war with NATO. And I don't think we're ever going to get to a stage where Russia has invaded a NATO country in Eastern Europe, whether it be Finland or Poland, and we've got Grant Shapps putting out a statement in the same way that the Prime Minister did with COVID, saying, "Oh, we need to get civilians in the army." I just don't think that's. I agree.
I don't know, actually, to be honest. I think it's very interesting to think about how conscription kind of would take place. You'd probably have influencers on Instagram saying, I've just joined up to this
yeah,
call,
they would.
you know, and you should come and join me for the chance to brush shoulders in the trenches.
But the idea that you're there and you've been called up and you're still posting on Instagram going, oh, look, I'm having a great time.
You see it with Ukraine, actually.
Exactly
a lot of TikTok content is coming out of Ukraine with Ukrainian young soldiers making stuff.
It's propaganda. It's fundamentally propaganda.
But it does also, you know, with at the time of war fatigue for a lot of the Western world, I think it continues to bring up those conversations. And I think one of my big issues with potentially signing up to the army and fighting is that I know at the end of the day I am fighting other young people like me who are just following orders from a larger entity, and I think that is something that I would be very difficult.
So that's changed, hasn't it? Because when people were called up in 1940, that would not have been on their mind.
Well, there were well-documented cases in the First World War of soldiers who didn't understand what the brutality of war was going to be. You've got to understand about the First War, the context of it. You know, there'd never been a war fought like this, particularly in Europe. And there were a lot of cases of British soldiers coming over the top into no man's land and firing their guns up in the air because they had no incentive to just be, blown to smithereens.
And
people
you
of another
see it
country.
in the Christmas armistice, you know, the football match in the middle of no man's land. I mean, there's that is there. People recognise that, but I think it became this, it's for the greater good. We have to push through. We have to dominate and we have to eradicate fascism. But at the end of the day, I mean, so much of Europe is descending towards fascism in different ways, I would argue. And I think that creates an interesting question. I
think the word fascist is overused.
I was about to say
Okay, absolutely.
Let's continue this offline because sadly I have to go to a break. Catherine and Jack, stay where you are. Thank you very much indeed. We'll